Hello, my name's Joe Greenwood-Hau. I'm a research fellow in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde, and I'm going to give you a brief presentation about a paper that I published in the journal Teaching in Higher Education. And the title of that article is Teaching Fact or Teaching Thinking. And what I'm aiming to address in the article and in this presentation is the question of how we should teach politics and social science in particular during a post-truth moment, which we've seen emerging in recent years. So I'll aim to give you a brief overview of the article and the arguments that I develop therein. So it starts with the idea that we've seen a rise in populism in the last few years. We've seen it in numerous different countries. Some examples are pictured here on the slide. Countries that we've seen populism rising in include, but are definitely not limited to, the United States, Hungary, Brazil, and India. And it's important to note that this is not the first time we've seen populism emerge. And indeed, there's a long literature covering what populism is and sort of putting forward different definitions of the concept, going all the way back to the 19th century, if not before, and sort of peasant or agrarian movements in both Russia and the United States. So we're very far from sort of being the first people to experience a rise in populism, but we certainly are living in a moment where there are numerous countries where populism has become stronger. And that literature that I mentioned, going back a long way, covering what populism is and when it first emerged, indicates how hard it is to define the concept. And indeed, there are still ongoing debates about what it means to be populist. But there's a very prevalent definition in political science, which focuses on the idea of populism sort of emphasizing the divide between the elites, who are often seen as sort of corrupt and untrustworthy, and the masses, who are seen as sort of reliable, honest, and often unrepresented by the elites who are in power. And that's certainly a facet that we observe in many of the examples of recently emerging populist movements that I've mentioned, as well as others. And so this rise of populism has often been coupled with another concept, which is particularly important for us if we're attempting to teach politics or social science or arguably in general, and that is the idea of post-truth. So as politics has become more polarized, we have seen that people are less willing to accept the positions put forward by those they're opposed to, and more willing to dismiss their claims, the claims of their opponents, as sort of lies or untrue, sort of almost irrespective of the quality of the evidence that there is on either side. And so we see the emergence of terms like fake news and alternative facts, and we have the phenomenon of people mistrusting what they call the mainstream media. And there are quite a lot of roots to this problem, one of which I've mentioned, which is the idea of people being more polarized and indeed affectively or emotionally polarized. So it's not especially cognitive, it's just that you see the other side, you know you don't like them or you disagree with them, so you find any reason to sort of dismiss what they are claiming. But that's not the only reason that's been identified for people being willing to label the views they oppose as fake or untrustworthy. And some have argued that this is partly to do with the environment we now inhabit in terms of the amount of information that's available to us, readily available on a daily basis. So we now, many people, numerous people across the globe have easy access to the internet, which basically means a vast amount of information at their fingertips, often numerous competing sources, and often if people are on social media, they'll be encountering lots of different people, giving them signals, giving them information, and it can be quite overwhelming. And so we get this idea of information overload, in which people kind of resign themselves to the impossibility of knowing which positions are more sustainable, or indeed whether there's such a thing as the truth. And so in that circumstance, it becomes more understandable that people sort of retreat into their existing beliefs and the social circles that sustain those existing beliefs, because there's some certainty there. And so, of course, they want to dismiss the other side and sustain their beliefs, because without that sustaining those beliefs, there's this kind of lack of ability to say if anything is true. And so we see assertion of beliefs. And in response to this, in academia and more widely in some sections of the media as well, there has been this urge to assert the validity of facts, a sort of as a counterbalance to this almost hopeless sense that there's no way of knowing what is true. And so we as teachers in higher education are sort of confronted by the conundrum in our classrooms of how to teach the idea that we can have things that we call facts when we live in an environment when so many people feel that it's very difficult to assess the quality of different arguments and know which things to believe. And the article that I'm talking about, which I published in the journal Teaching in Higher Education, makes the argument that the work of the feminist theorist and pedagogist bell Hooks, that this work can give us at least part of the answer to how we address this problem of attempting to teach facts when we're in an environment in which facts are very difficult to define even, or to sustain in the face of people's struggles with understanding what the quality of evidence is and whether there's even such a thing as truth. And bell Hooks puts forward the what she calls engaged pedagogy, which at the time and arguably currently is quite a radical approach to teaching, and it's about providing a very open forum in which to discuss ideas, ideally in small groups often, and having lots of sort of critical interaction between students and teachers, in which everyone is open to sort of revising their opinions, listening to others' opinions as well, and thinking critically not only about other people's views, but about their own views and the bases for those views. And I argue that this pedagogy can be used as a response to the potential underlying tension between facts and thinking that I outlined previously. And there's three reasons I think it's applicable in this situation. The first of which is it has a explicitly and intrinsically anti-authoritarian quality. Engaged pedagogy does. The second thing is that it's very clear about respecting and understanding different bases for knowing. And the third is that I think it's reconcilable with the idea of sustaining a scientific community, as opposed to the idea of the isolated individual working alone to create or knowledge or to understand the world. So I'll consider each of those in turn. The first idea is that engaged pedagogy is anti-authoritarian, and it is that in two senses at least. The first is that politically it's anti-authoritarian. It's aligned with the idea of supporting historically marginalized or oppressed groups, involving them in education, hearing their voices, and talking to people from those groups on an equal basis in an educational context, but also outside an educational context, actually learning from those experiences of oppression and using education to challenge that oppression. And what that means is that the second way in which it's anti-authoritarian is in the classroom. It provides this very egalitarian basis for teaching, in which it is not assumed that the teacher is necessarily a figure of authority who goes into the classroom with knowledge which they then tell students, and students go away knowing more than they came in because the teacher gave them knowledge. Instead, everybody comes into the classroom as an equal, and views are exchanged, ideas are developed, knowledge is constructed based on different experiences, different information that is contributed by both students and teachers. And in this context, the teacher's role is essentially more of a facilitator, although the teacher must also recognize that their experience in education and studying the subject that they are a teacher in means that they may have more reference points or potentially more diverse reference points to contribute to the discussion, but they do not necessarily assume that their knowledge is more valid. And so this is a very, as I say, anti-authoritarian teaching context. And so that's the first basis on which I think that Hook's pedagogy, engaged pedagogy, can be used to help us teach the idea of facts and what facts might be in the context of prevalent post-truth moment. The second reason that I think it's useful is that it accommodates different bases for knowing. And the idea here is that instead of creating this binary between people's personal experiences that they've had in their lives and the idea of objective scientific facts, it accepts that both of these things contribute to our knowledge, and that indeed they can help. Those two bases of facts can be used to revise each other and therefore to construct a new form of knowledge which combines both the kind of things that we think of classically as facts emerging from objective scientific study with people's experiences of their day-to-day lives. So we might think here of the idea of having statistics that relate to inequality but have potentially missed a facet of inequality. And so if we go through our academic study of the idea of inequality and we're only talking about class inequality, or we're only talking about gender inequality, or we're only talking about ethnic inequality, and then someone comes into the teaching context and says, well, actually, my experience isn't of class inequality, it's of gender inequality, or some combination of class, gender, and ethnic inequality, and we need to revise the way we are measuring and studying inequality to reflect the experiences of people like me, as well as people who are experiencing class inequality on its own, for instance. Here we have a way to take into account both statistical, sort of classically scientific ways of understanding a concept, but also to revise that and accommodate individual knowledge that is drawn from life experience. And so the engaged pedagogy allows us to do this. It doesn't go in saying one form of knowledge is better than the other and we must prioritize one or only use one. And I think that enables us to allow students to work in a context in which they know that their knowledge is valued and useful, and that hopefully will make them more open to the idea that other people's knowledge, and indeed this classically scientific or statistical knowledge, or whatever our basis for what we call objective knowledge is, that might also have some utility. And combined with the anti-authoritarian context, it means that students become responsible for creating knowledge because they are contributing their own experience. They are hopefully being prompted to think about things like academic studies which show other ways of knowing about political phenomenon as well as their own lives, and they are being asked to come into a context in which they, with other students and the teacher, reconcile these things together and construct knowledge. And so hopefully this overcomes the tension between facts and my own knowledge. You know, this, well, I don't believe that fact because that's not what I know or what people I know say. So that's the second reason why I argue that engaged pedagogy is helpful in this context. And the third reason, which follows on from that, is the idea that it accommodates a scientific community. And indeed, this is a challenge to the idea that scientific progress comes from you know, an isolated individual. So here we see this quote from Hollis in 2003 saying that that scientific knowledge and the development of science within those fields, the heroic saga of the isolated individual genius, is purely a myth. In other words, the way that we understand the world through science is by working with others who review our work, who challenge our ideas, who question why we've hypothesized something or why we've measured a concept in a particular way or tested our hypotheses using a particular method. Without this process of review, of critique, we do not and cannot construct scientific knowledge. And that is very easy to reconcile with the context I've just described in a classroom of people coming together, discussing their own perspectives, discussing the literature, the articles, maybe discussing their own primary research, and through that process, creating knowledge. And so in essence, in that teaching context, the classroom functions as a small scientific community. And that allows facts to have a very important role, but it also teaches people to understand that facts have a particular basis, which is these various forms of knowledge that we have, which allow us, if we draw them together, to say, well, with a certain degree of confidence, we can conclude that all of this evidence together, the personal experiences, the statistics we've got, the interviews that have been done, whatever the evidence is, if we take all of that into account, we can reasonably confidently say that this constitutes a fact given our current array of knowledge. And so, as I say, this is the third reason I think engaged pedagogy helps us deal with reconciling facts with a post-truth moment. So hopefully that has piqued your interest in the article that I'm talking about. As I say, the full title of it is Teaching Facts or Teaching Thinking, and there's a subtitle, which is The Potential of Hooke's Engaged Pedagogy for Teaching Politics in a Post-Truth Moment. Now, I do think the arguments that I develop are hopefully applicable in context beyond the teaching of politics, but certainly the examples I work through relate to politics. And because populism and post-truth are particularly political concepts, I also think the argument has particular relevance to politics, but you can be the judge of that if you wish to read the article, and it's available in Teaching Higher Education, was published in 2021. If you either don't have access to the article or you don't have time to read it, or your interest hasn't been piqued quite enough, then you can read a blog instead, in which I essentially summarize the arguments I've made in this presentation and that I make in the article. And of course, if you want to get in touch with me, you can find my details on the internet. I would be very pleased to hear from you if you have thoughts on these arguments. But either way, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you read the article or the blog, that you enjoy those. So thank you very much indeed.